Alright, hey guys, it's Morgan from RacerX Performance Tuning. Today we're going to be talking about our Tactrix 2.0 cable, how we can set it up, how we can put it in the car, so we can do our data logging and our flashing of our flashable ECUs. Okay, so if you've got a Tactrix 2.0 cable, it's going to come with, at a minimum, a USB cable, and you may or may not need one or another type of adapter depending on your system. So with the USB cable, it's going to have a mini USB side, and that's always going to go right into this section of your Tactrix cable. For some of you guys, like the Evo 10 guys, this is all you're going to need to be able to data log and to flash your ECUs. Now for other guys, we're going to need some additional pieces. And so depending on your system, if you have, let's say, a second generation 3000 GT Stealth or GTO, you're going to need a flash adapter, and that flash adapter is going to come like this, and it's going to plug into this RCA jack. Right, so between these two and your OBD port and your flash port, that's how you're going to be able to read, write to your ECU, as well as do your data logging. If you have a first generation 3000 GT Stealth or GTO, you're going to have a different adapter altogether. This is because your car does not come with an OBD2 port. It comes with an OBD1 port, in which case we need to take this adapter, attach it like this to your Tactrix cable, and then take this RCA cable and plug it into the back here. Now you will plug this end into your OBD1 port. This cable adapter will convert it to OBD2, and that's all you're going to need to do your data logging and to do your flashing. So the next thing to do is to hook up the Tactrix cable and potentially the flash port cable to your car. And depending on the year of your car and what's already been done to it, you may or may not have a flash adapter connected, and we'll talk about that momentarily. This car already has a flash adapter, which we see right here, and then above that, the black one is our OBD2 connector. So we take our Tactrix cable, line it up in the same orientation as our OBD2 is, plug it in there, and then take our flash adapter, and again, try to line it up in the same orientation as our adapter female portion is, and connect that there. Once you have both adapters connected, then you're ready to take the USB end of things and plug that into your laptop. So one of the single most important pieces of data that your tuner is going to want to need you to data log is going to be your air-fuel ratio. So every car is going to have or install an AFR gauge. AFR stands for air-fuel ratio, and that's going to measure the amount of fuel and air that's currently in the system. So an AFR gauge is connected to a wideband sensor, which is installed in your exhaust. So basically, it's going to measure how much air and fuel ratio is going past the exhaust after everything's run out of the engine. And that is going to be critical for your tuner to use, because depending on what RPM and boost pressure your car is under, you're going to be wanting to run at different levels of air-fuel ratio. Now essentially there are two ways to get the data from the AFR gauge into your data log. And so every gauge is going to have some outputs on it. So if you kind of disengage the gauge from the gauge pod, and you can look on the back here, this happens to be a glow shift gauge, so it's a little bit limited, but you start to see the harness connection there, and there are some wires. And you're going to have basically two types of output. You're either going to have a digital output or a serial output. Okay, now the digital output is going to be like a 5-volt value, somewhere between 0 and 5, and that number, wherever it ends up between 0 and 5, is going to basically equate to an AFR value. So you have to put that into the system and do a little bit of an algorithm to convert that number, depending on the type of gauge it is, to the actual AFR data. Okay, and that's one way that's typical in 3000 GTs that have typical AFR gauge. Another way to do it is with what's known as a serial output. So I'm going to show you that, how you set that up, and that is almost always used on the Evos, but can also be used on other cars as well. So the point here is that one way or the other, you're going to need to get the data out of the gauge itself and into the data log. So if we're going with this this 5-volt digital output, there's a wideband output and narrow band output, and we're going to look for the wideband output. We identify which wire it is that has that output to it, and we have to wire that into our ECU right down there at the ECU's harness. Additionally, we're also going to need another wire that's going to be our ground wire, and we're going to want to ground that wire to the ECU's sensor ground. So 2 wires that we're going to need to hook up to the ECU. So essentially you're going to come down here, dig out your ECU's wiring harness connections, identify the right pin numbers, and for the AFR 5-volt input, that wire, if there's one already in there, you can cut it and use it. If there's not one, you're going to have to actually put a pin in it, and you connect that to the 5-volt output from your AFR gauge. And then for the sensor ground, that one you're just going to splice into it. You don't want to cut that wire because that sensor ground is going to be used by a number of other tools, and so you want to keep that one intact. You just want to tap into it. So up next, I'm going to show you which pins you're going to need based on what model of car you've got, and that's pretty much that. Now, depending on the AFR gauge you have, you're going to have to work with the instructions to identify which wire is which coming out of that output side of the gauge. So in this most simplistic AEM gauge, and a lot of times we're just going to default to AEM gauges because they are kind of the industry standard, you'll have a black wire, and that's going to be your ground wire. So that's the one we talked about, grounding out to the sensor ground on the ECU harness. Right. Additionally, you have a white wire, and that's your 0 to 5 volt. That's the analog output that we've been talking about to this point. So you can use that to wire into that part of the ECU harness. And then finally, there's also a blue wire here, which is your serial output. And that we would connect if we're going to use the serial output only. We're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up next in this video. If, however, you have an AEM X series gauge, it's going to be a little bit more complex because there's 2 output connectors on the back. There's connector A and there's connector B. So it's important that you're working off of connector A. And in this case, you're still going to have a blue wire, which is going to be for that serial output that we talked about. We're going to get the serial output directly from the gauge into EvoScan. And then you're going to have a white wire here in number 9. There, number 9, that is going to be your 5-volt analog output that we would wire into the ECU harness. And now you've also got a brown wire here in number 10. That brown wire is your ground wire. So you're going to make sure you need to definitely ground that to the sensor ground. You have a black wire here, which is also being grounded, but you definitely have to wire that brown wire from number 10 to the sensor ground, because if you fail to do that, the readings on the AFR gauge are going to be completely inaccurate. Now, when you're looking at your ECU and you're identifying the pins that you're going to need, on a first generation, that's the 91 through 93 turbo models of the 3000 GTs, your sensor ground is going to be right here. It's going to be pin 72. So it's the last pin on the last harness connection. And on the second generations, 94 through 97, it's going to be pin 92. Right, so that's one you're going to tap into there. Don't cut that line, just tap into it because it's going to be used by some other things. And for your AFRs, the analog 5-volt output, that's going to be pin number 55 on the first gens and pin number 75 on the second gens. So that line, there may or may not be a pin in there. If there isn't, you're going to need to pin it yourself and wire it up. But if there is a pin in there, you can actually cut that wire and then just connect your serial 5-volt, not serial, your analog 5-volt output to that wire right there. Okay, and if you decide to go with the serial output, the advantage there is that you don't have to do any algorithmic calculations in EvoScan or anything. Whatever the gauge is showing is going to be exactly what's going to be recorded into EvoScan. However, you're going to need to buy a few more pieces of equipment. First, you're going to need to buy an EvoScan serial cable. So this cable has obviously got a serial port on the one end, and then you've got two wires. Your blue wire here is going to connect to that serial output from your AFR gauge, and the white wire, you're going to connect that to any ground source on the car. So just connect that up, and that's all you need to get the information from the AFR gauge into this cable. Now, being that this is a serial cable, the problem is most people don't have a serial port on their laptop. They stopped making those a long time ago. So what you're going to need next, and by the way, this we can get from STM Tune, the good buddies of mine, and I'll drop a link for that into the description so you know where to get one of these. They don't cost very much at all. So the next piece I said you're going to need is this one, and this is called a serial to USB converter. So it's going to take that serial input that we had, and it's going to convert it to a USB. Because we have USB ports in our laptop, that's what we're going to need next. So essentially it's going to connect these two together, the serial to the serial USB adapter, and now you've got that connection to get the data. But one thing that's important though, before you do this connection, you want to just take this serial to USB converter and plug the USB port into your laptop. What's going to happen is it's going to load some drivers onto your laptop, and you want to get that done first before you try to do all of this. Once those drivers are done, then you're ready to use this thing. So you'll connect those things up and be ready to go. But now you've got one more problem. Because you've got a USB port here, and on your Tactrix you've also got a USB port, you're going to need to find a way to get both of these into your laptop. Now, most people only have one USB opening on their laptop. So the last piece you're going to need is this right here. It's a USB hub. These are pretty easy to buy. I've got 4 inputs here, and this one's going to go to the laptop, so I can then easily just plug in my Tactrix cable and plug in my USB to serial, and then right away I'm into the laptop and I'm capturing all the data. Now, this is the way to go if you want to use that serial output from your AFR gauge. And for the Evo 10 guys, basically all the Evo guys, this is really the only way to go, because there's not another way to kind of get AFR data into EvoScan in a way that it's going to understand it and use an algorithm. And that's that. Once you've opened up ECUFlash, the very first thing you're going to want to do is select the vehicle type. So from the menu bar, select ECU and then select vehicle type. From there, you'll see a list of all the types. For the 3000 GT, select the one all the way at the top for HA539F, and you're done. As a good best practice, the first thing you're going to want to do is back up your existing calibration. With the key in the on position, everything connected up to your Tactrix cables, you'll be able to select ECU and then read from ECU. This is going to download everything that's on the ECU currently and present it on your screen. From there, you can select save and save this as a good backup file. If you start seeing error messages when you try to do this read, it almost 100% means that there's a bad connection somewhere. Go back and review all of your connections, unplug and replug the USB cable, and try again. Once you started working with your tuner, or if you're doing the tuning yourself and you've made some updates to your calibration, the next thing you're going to want to do is to write that update, that new calibration, to the ECU. This is a process known as flashing. So in order to flash your ECU, you're going to first open up the file that's going to have the calibration with the updates that you want, either the one you made or the one that your tuner sent you. Make sure everything's connected and the key is in the on position. Then all these icons at the top are going to start to show in color as opposed to being grayed out. From here, the first thing you can do, at least the first few times, is do a test write to ECU. This is just going to be a way just to kind of make sure everything's working right without actually doing anything. Once you've done that once or twice, you won't need to do it anymore. And then you can just go directly to write to ECU. Again, what's going to happen now is that the ECU flash is going to start writing this memory on top of the memory that once was on your ECU. When all is said and done, you'll get a successful message. Click OK, turn the key to the off position, and now you're ready. If for any reason you get an error message during the middle or the end of this process, keep the key in the on position and try to do the write again. If it continues to fail, keep the key in the on position anyway, load up an old file that you know works, and write that one. Just don't turn the key off until you've successfully written a new calibration to your ECU. EvoScan is going to be your data logger, and it's important that you have it set up correctly. Once you've opened it up, in the upper left-hand side, choose Open Port 2.0 since you're running a Tactrix 2.0 cable. From the checkboxes for the 3000 GT, Stealth, and GTO, choose Mitsubishi MUT3. You can also use that for the DSM Eclipses. In the drop-down, choose EFI. If you were running an Evo, you would choose the CAN 2006 Plus checkbox on the left, and that'll give you options for Golden, Mode 23, and even RacerX Fast Logging. But we'll save that for another video. With the MUT3 from Mitsubishi selected, you're going to have these data log options. If you're working with RacerX Performance Tuning, we're going to send you a custom XML file that have all the items that you're going to want to data log. If you're using the 5-volt analog output from your AFR gauge, you're going to want to select wideband scaled in the data logging items list. If, however, you happen to be using the serial output, then you're going to use the external wideband AF ratio logging item. Finally, in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to want to put your injector scaling size. Here you're going to take the injector size that you've bought and take off 15%. So if you have 1000 cc injectors, in this box put 850 and then click the Save Settings as Default button and you're ready to go. If you go with that 5-volt output, the digital output from the gauge, and wire it through the ECU harness as we talked about, you have to do a couple things. Let's say if you're using a 3000 GT, for example, and you're in ECUFlash, well, there's a section here in the ROM, and it's called some sensor scalings. We've got one for a map sensor, and then we've got this wideband sensor. So you have to go in here, number one, and then here you'll find that 0 to 5 volt scale. There's 0, there's 5, and on the majority of gauges, 0 volts equals 10 AFR and 5 volts equals 20 AFR. But you're going to need to look at your gauge documentation. Even within AEM, there's two different versions. Some of the gauges use this 0 to 5 volt scale, and others use a 0.5 to 4.5 scale, which is very different, and also like 8.5 to 18 over here. So definitely you want to make sure you get that documentation in front of you and set up this table correctly, because when you write this to the ECU as part of your calibration, that's the data that it's going to use as part of its conversion to get those volts and send them over to EvoScan to record that. So if we flip back over to EvoScan, we can see how this is going to be recorded over there. So in EvoScan, we can see, and this is set up for, let's say, a 3000 GT. So we've got the Mitsubishi MUT3 protocol on EFI. And then as we scroll down here, we'll find a a logging field called wideband scaled. You can see its request is BF, and there's a little bit of an algorithm here, which is going to convert that value that we kind of sent through ECUFlash from the calibration from the ECU, and it's going to send that over here to EvoScan. EvoScan is going to run this algorithm against it, and that's actually going to end up being the AFR that we want to record. However, if you go with that serial output, then you won't need to do any conversion, no algorithm, anything like this. You won't even need this to be logged at all. And what you'll use is this field right here called the external wideband air-fuel ratio. You notice there's no algorithm applied to it, and that's because the serial cable is sending exactly what's on the gauge directly to EvoScan. So this is going to show up, and it's going to be exactly what you're seeing on the gauge. There's a little bit more work to do here, though. So if you want to go with the external wideband AFR ratio, you're going to need to do a couple of things. One, once you plugged in that USB to serial port converter, you're going to have to go over and start up something called Device Manager. It's not that hard to find. Just type it into your Windows thing, and we'll open it up. And inside of Device Manager, we're going to have a little section called Ports. So we've got COM ports here. And we can see right away, there's my prolific USB to serial COM port. It's on number 4, so COM number 4. All I want to do is just take note of that. But where am I going to use it is important. So coming back over to EvoScan, come up here at the top and you see this wideband section. We're going to have a couple things to do here. One, under select wideband serial COM port, you can see over to the right here we've got various COM ports that are active on my laptop right now, but the one I want to select is COM port 4 because that's the one that we know is that prolific USB to serial to USB converter. So once I've selected that, that's going to help me with the connection. And the next thing we're going to need to do is select our AFR gauge. Now, EvoScan only really works in this way with serial ports with basically 2 gauges, because I don't know anybody who has a Ztronics, but AEM and Innovate. Most people are going to have an AEM gauge, so if you just select the 9600 baud rate protocol, it's going to work, regardless of whatever AEM gauge you have. So, 2 things to select. You got your serial port, select it as COM port 4, and then select your gauge, which here we have an AEM Waco gauge selected, and then that's it. We can just go ahead and start recording our data, and our data is going to be right there for our AFR values. One really nice feature in EvoScan is the live map tracer. So click on Graphs and Map Tracer in the menu item at the top, and then choose Live Map Tracer from the one item available. You can move this window around so that you can both view the main EvoScan screen and the live map tracer at the same time. The main area I like to work with is this section in the middle with the black mini windows with the red digital outputs. These are areas where we can see the visual data exactly as it's running currently as it's coming through EvoScan. So you can set these up just by right-clicking in the box itself and selecting the items that you want to display. I typically like to see the RPM, the AFR map, the wideband scale, which is going to be really important for us right now. I like to see the O2 feedback, and I like to see at least the front or rear O2 sensors. I can see the discycling, and also like to keep my battery level up here since sometimes we're with key on and not running the car. We want to make sure our battery level is staying well. So with everything connected correctly and the car running, click the Start Data Logger button.
Staged.
If everything is set up properly, the colors will change from yellow to green, and now we'll be data logging. At this point, we're able to look at that section in the middle to see those items that we set up for the digital readout. And one area we're going to look at most importantly is wideband scale. Since we've got that 5-volt analog output running in, we want to validate that the scaling that we set up in ECUFlash and we flashed over to the car's, to the ECU, is matching what we actually see on our physical gauge. So here, keep an eye on the wideband scaled box there in the middle, and then turn your vision over to your actual AFR gauge in the car. These two should be pretty close together. Maybe sometimes it seems like ECUFlash EvoScan is sort of chasing the gauge, but as long as these values are pretty close together, then we know we've got it done correctly. If the values are far apart, we need to go back in and revisit our scaling and make sure that we've got that correct, or make sure our grounding is correct. Any of these items that say that this AFR data that we're seeing in EvoScan is different than the gauge, it's going to be important to get that fixed correctly. Otherwise, all of our tuning will always be based off of bad values, and it'll never be correct. Now you're ready to drive the car around and capture your data log. When you're all done, click the Stop Data Logger button. Be sure to click that button before you turn the car off. Then, you'll be able to find your data log in your Documents, EvoScan, Save Data Logs folder. Choose the file and you can open it up. It's a CSV file, so you'll be able to read it in Excel or open it up in Megalog Viewer, or send it to your tuner, who's going to obviously do some analysis and make some updates for you. So that's going to wrap things up, guys. I really hope that this little tutorial video has been helpful for you. Certainly if you've got any comments or questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. Otherwise, RacerX Performance is wishing you, as always, to stay safe and stay tuned.